Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, grateful to share a quiet moment with you. Tell me, how does your evening find you? Is there lamplight nearby, a cup of tea cooling at your elbow, the soft hush that invites thought? These were the hours Dr. Watson trusted most, when patience and careful observation gave shape to truth. If such moments comfort you, do consider subscribing. Now, settle in, for one must observe carefully before one can reason. Chapter 1. A Name, Written in Fog. The November fog that had settled upon London with such sullen persistence showed no sign of lifting as the evening drew on. From the windows of our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, the familiar thoroughfare had been transformed into a dim and spectral passage, where the gas lamps glowed like distant embers suspended in an impenetrable grey sea. It was the sort of atmosphere that seemed to muffle not only sound but the very passage of time itself, lending to our comfortable quarters an island quality, as though we had been set adrift from the ordinary world. I had spent the better part of the afternoon absorbed in the pages of a medical journal, while Sherlock Holmes occupied himself with what appeared to be a chemical analysis of tobacco ash, a pursuit that had left our quarters redolent with various exotic aromas. The afternoon post had brought nothing of particular interest, and I confess that a certain restlessness had begun to manifest itself in my companion's manner. He had abandoned his microscope twice to pace before the window, hands clasped behind his back, his keen grey eyes searching the fog as though willing it to yield up some problem worthy of his attention. It was shortly after 7 o'clock when Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor. Holmes turned from the window with an expression of immediate interest, and I marked the subtle transformation that always overtook him at the prospect of a new case. The languor that had characterized his movements but moments before vanished entirely, replaced by that peculiar intensity of focus that I had come to recognize as the hallmark of his engagement. "Show him up at once, Mrs. Hudson," said Holmes, and I detected in his voice a note of anticipation. Our visitor proved to be a gentleman of perhaps 35 years, dressed with quiet elegance in a dark overcoat still beaded with moisture from the fog. He was of medium height and spare build, with regular features and thoughtful brown eyes that conveyed both intelligence and a certain habitual composure. His manner as he entered was that of a man accustomed to professional society, yet beneath the surface courtesy I detected an undercurrent of genuine distress. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, though his gaze had already identified my friend with certainty. "I am he," replied Holmes, extending his hand. "And this is my friend and colleague Dr. Watson, in whose discretion you may place absolute confidence. Pray be seated, Mr. Mallory, and tell us what brings you through such inclement weather to Baker Street." Our visitor started slightly at hearing his name spoken before he had introduced himself, but recovered his composure with admirable swiftness. A faint smile touched his lips as he settled into the chair Holmes indicated. "I see that your reputation for observation is well founded, Mr. Holmes," he said, "though I confess myself at a loss to understand how you identified me." "A trifle," said Holmes, dismissing the matter with a wave of his hand. "The monogram upon your pocket handkerchief, partially visible, reads E.M., and the card case protruding slightly from your breast pocket bears the gilt lettering of Weatherby and Sons, the publishers. A recent issue of the bookseller contained an announcement of Mr. Edwin Mallory's elevation to junior partner at that distinguished firm. The conclusion was elementary. But these are mere parlour tricks, Mr. Mallory. You have not braved this fog to see me perform conjuring tricks. What is the nature of the trouble that brings you here?" Mallory leaned forward, his composure giving way to evident concern. "You're quite right, Mr. Holmes. I come on a matter of the gravest delicacy, one that touches upon both personal tragedy and professional honour. 3 days ago, Sir Lionel Harcourt died suddenly at his home in Belgrave Square. The jurist and essayist," I interjected, recognition stirring in my memory. "I read of his death in the Times. A distinguished career, if memory serves, both on the bench and in letters." "Precisely, Dr. Watson," said Mallory, inclining his head. Sir Lionel was among the most respected legal minds of our generation, a man whose integrity was beyond question. His essays on jurisprudence and moral philosophy were widely admired. Our firm had the honour of publishing his collected works these past 15 years. And yet, observed Holmes, his fingers steepled before him, you speak of delicacy and honour in a manner that suggests something beyond natural grief. The Times reported the death as resulting from heart failure. Was the report inaccurate? The medical facts are not in dispute, replied Mallory carefully. Sir Lionel's physician, Dr. Basil Rowan, certified that death resulted from cardiac arrest, a condition for which Sir Lionel had been treated in recent years. The coroner was satisfied, and there will be no inquest. In every material particular, it appears a natural death. Then wherein lies the difficulty? Asked Holmes, though I could see from the intensity of his gaze that he had already perceived the existence of some deeper complexity. Mallory drew a long breath, as though steeling himself. Sir Lionel was discovered in his study, seated at his writing desk. Beside his body was found a document, a letter of confession, bearing his signature. The content of that letter, Mr. Holmes, alleged certain judicial improprieties from early in his career, matters that would, if made public, destroy utterly the reputation he had spent a lifetime building. A deathbed confession, I murmured, brought on perhaps by the approach of mortality and a desire to unburden his conscience. That is precisely what Scotland Yard believes, Dr. Watson, said Mallory, and it is precisely what troubles me profoundly. For you see, gentlemen, I had occasion to discuss these very allegations with Sir Lionel not 1 week before his death. He was aware that certain parties wished him to make such an admission. He was, in fact, approached by intermediaries suggesting that such a confession might be advisable, and he refused absolutely. More than that, he gave me his solemn word that he would never affix his signature to any such document, for the simple reason that the allegations were entirely false. Holmes's eyes had grown very bright. And yet the signature is genuine? I have examined it myself, Mr. Holmes, as has Lady Harcourt and others who knew his hand intimately. It is unquestionably Sir Lionel's signature. The handwriting throughout the document is his. Every expert who has viewed it confirms its authenticity. Mallory's voice dropped, and yet I cannot shake the conviction that something is terribly wrong. Sir Lionel was not a man to compromise his principles or to confess to crimes he had not committed, even at the point of death. The man I knew would have faced disgrace and scandal rather than lie, even to save his reputation. Holmes rose and crossed to the window, standing for a long moment in silent contemplation of the fog-shrouded street below. When he turned back to us, his manner had become crisp and decisive. "You have acted wisely in bringing this matter to my attention, Mr. Mallory," he said. "There are aspects of your account that interest me considerably. I shall require access to the document in question, to Sir Lionel's study, and to those persons who were in close contact with him during his final days. Can you arrange this?" "I believe so," replied Mallory, relief evident in his voice. "Lady Harcourt has expressed her wish that the matter be examined thoroughly before any decision is made regarding publication or suppression of the confession. She's a woman of considerable strength of character." "Excellent. Watson, we shall call upon Lady Harcourt tomorrow morning, if that is convenient to you, Mr. Mallory. In the meantime, I should like you to provide me with a complete list of all persons who had regular access to Sir Lionel's residence, and who might have had knowledge of this alleged confession." As Mallory departed into the fog some 20 minutes later, armed with Holmes's instructions and visibly heartened by my friend's interest in the case, I turned to find Holmes standing once more at the window, his profile sharp against the dim glow of the street lamps. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked. He did not turn from his contemplation of the fog. "I make of it, Watson, that we are dealing with something rather more subtle than a guilty conscience or a deathbed revelation. A man's reputation is a curious thing. It may be built over decades through genuine merit, yet destroyed in moments by the stroke of a pen. The question that interests me is this: whose hand truly guided that pen? For I suspect we shall find that the author of Sir Lionel Harcourt's supposed confession was not Sir Lionel Harcourt at all. With those enigmatic words he turned from the window and took up his pipe, settling into his chair with an expression of profound concentration. The game, as he was fond of saying, was afoot, and the fog that pressed upon our windows seemed suddenly less oppressive than it had moments before. Somewhere in the grey labyrinth of London, a truth lay hidden, and Sherlock Holmes had determined to uncover it. Chapter 2. The Circle of the Respectable. The fog had lifted somewhat by the following morning, though a persistent dampness clung to the air as our hansom made its way through the streets toward Belgrave Square. Holmes had been unusually silent during our journey, his eyes fixed upon the passing scene with that peculiar intensity that indicated his mind was already at work upon the problem before us. I had learned long ago not to interrupt such reveries, and so we travelled in companionable silence until the cab drew up before an imposing townhouse of pale stone, its architecture speaking of wealth tempered by restraint. Mr. Mallory had preceded us, and was waiting in the entrance hall when we were shown in by a solemn-faced butler. The house itself seemed to reflect the gravity of recent events. The mirrors had been draped, and the servants moved with that hushed tread peculiar to households in mourning. Yet there was nothing of theatrical grief about the place. Rather, it conveyed a sense of dignity under strain, as though the very walls were determined to maintain propriety in the face of tragedy. "Lady Harcourt will receive you in the morning room," Mallory informed us quietly. "I should perhaps warn you, gentlemen, that she is a woman of considerable reserve. The circumstances have been most trying for her, yet she bears them with remarkable fortitude." We were conducted through a series of well-appointed rooms to a chamber overlooking a small garden at the rear of the house. Lady Harcourt rose to meet us as we entered. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, tall and slender, with iron grey hair arranged with severe elegance and dark eyes that suggested both intelligence and an habitual guardedness. Her morning dress was impeccable, and she extended her hand to Holmes with a gesture that was courteous yet maintained a certain distance. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, her voice low and perfectly modulated. "Mr. Mallory has spoken of your reputation. I confess I was initially uncertain whether to pursue this matter further, but I find I cannot rest while questions remain unanswered about my husband's final hours." "Your candour does you credit, Lady Harcourt," replied Holmes. "I hope you will extend that same candour to my inquiries, which may at times seem intrusive or indelicate. I can promise only that my sole interest lies in discovering the truth." "Truth," she repeated, and something flickered across her composed features. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. Whatever the cost to comfort or reputation, I find I must know the truth. My husband was not a perfect man, but he was a truthful one. That is why this confession troubles me so profoundly." Holmes had taken a seat at her invitation, and I observed him studying our hostess with that comprehensive glance that missed no detail. "I wonder, Lady Harcourt, if you might describe for me the days immediately preceding your husband's death, his state of mind, any unusual visitors or correspondence, any deviation from his customary routine." Lady Harcourt settled into her chair with the careful precision of one who has learned to govern her emotions through rigid self-control. Sir Lionel had been somewhat preoccupied for perhaps a fortnight before his death. He did not confide the source of his concern, though I gathered it related to some legal matter from his past. There were letters, Mr. Holmes, letters that he read and immediately destroyed. When I inquired, he assured me it was nothing of consequence, merely old grievances being stirred by malicious persons. Did he mention names? He did not. My husband was protective of my sensibilities, Mr. Holmes, sometimes excessively so. He believed that certain aspects of public life should not intrude upon the domestic sphere. "And yet," said Holmes gently, "you must have formed some impression of the nature of these troubles." For the first time, Lady Harcourt's composure wavered slightly. I feared it had to do with a decision he had rendered early in his judicial career, a case involving commercial fraud. There were suggestions at the time that he had been influenced in his verdict. The allegations were never substantiated, and Sir Lionel's subsequent career demonstrated his integrity beyond question. Yet such whispers have a way of persisting, Mr. Holmes, particularly when there are those who benefit from their persistence. Before Holmes could respond, the door opened to admit a man of middle age, soberly dressed, carrying the black bag that proclaimed his profession. His face was distinguished by a high forehead and penetrating blue eyes that conveyed professional authority. "Dr. Rowan," said Lady Harcourt, "these are Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, who Mr. Mallory has engaged to examine the circumstances of Sir Lionel's death." Dr. Basil Rowan acknowledged us with a slight bow, though I detected a certain wariness in his manner. "I understood the matter had been settled," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "The medical evidence was quite clear." "Indeed," said Holmes, "which is precisely why your professional observations interest me greatly, Doctor. You attended Sir Lionel in his final illness." "I had been his physician for some 7 years," replied Rowan, setting down his bag with deliberate care. "His heart had been a source of concern for the past 3. He suffered from angina, which I managed with rest and medication. The attack that claimed his life was, while unfortunate, not entirely unexpected given his condition and age." "And his mental state during those final weeks?" Rowan hesitated, glancing at Lady Harcourt before responding. "He was anxious, certainly. Whether that anxiety contributed to the cardiac event is a matter of medical speculation. Emotional strain can certainly exacerbate such conditions. But you observed nothing that suggested suicidal despair or overwhelming guilt." "I am a physician, Mr. Holmes, not a psychologist," said Rowan stiffly. "I attend to the body. The soul I leave to clergymen." Holmes appeared satisfied with this evasion and turned his attention back to Lady Harcourt. "I should like to speak with anyone else who was in regular contact with Sir Lionel during this period. I understand he employed a secretary." "Miss Eleanor Finch," said Lady Harcourt. "She has been with us for 4 years and was devoted to my husband's work. She's in the library cataloguing his papers. I shall have her sent for." Miss Finch proved to be a woman of perhaps 30 years, neatly dressed in grey, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and an air of quiet competence. She entered with the deferential manner of one accustomed to serving without being noticed, yet I marked in her expression a genuine grief that the others, for all their propriety, had not displayed quite so openly. "Miss Finch," Holmes began, his tone softening perceptibly, "I understand you worked closely with Sir Lionel on his literary endeavours." "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "I managed his correspondence, organised his research materials, and prepared his manuscripts for submission to the publishers. It was the greatest privilege of my professional life." "And during these past weeks, did you observe any change in his working habits or demeanour?" Miss Finch folded her hands before her, a gesture that seemed to steady her. "He was troubled, Mr. Holmes. There is no denying it. His concentration was not what it had been. He would begin a letter and abandon it, or sit for long periods staring at nothing. Yet when I asked if I might be of assistance, he was always kind, always assured me that all was well." "Did he dictate the confession to you, Miss Finch?" "No, sir," she said firmly. "I knew nothing of any confession until after his death. Sir Lionel had not dictated anything to me for several days before the end. He said his thoughts were too disordered, that he needed time to organise them before committing them to paper." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "So the last documents you prepared for him were written when?" "Nearly a week before his death, sir. A letter to the Times regarding judicial reform and a note to Mr. Mallory concerning a contract for his next volume of essays." "And his handwriting during that period? Had you noticed any deterioration?" Miss Finch's brow furrowed. "Now that you mention it, Mr. Holmes, yes. His hand had become less steady in recent weeks. He complained once or twice of tremors. Yet the confession bears a firm signature." "I have not seen the document, sir. Lady Harcourt felt it would distress me unnecessarily. Holmes rose, and I recognised the signs of a mind beginning to perceive patterns in what had seemed disconnected observations. "You have all been most helpful," he said. "With your permission, Lady Harcourt, I should now like to examine Sir Lionel's study, undisturbed if possible." "Of course," she replied, rising with fluid grace. "Mr. Mallory will show you the—" "Way! The room has been left exactly as it was found." As we followed Mallory up the stairs, I observed that Holmes's expression had taken on that quality of suppressed excitement that indicated he had already begun to formulate theories, though he would not share them until evidence supported speculation. The pieces of our puzzle were being assembled, and I sensed that the respectable circle we had just encountered held secrets that propriety and social position had thus far concealed. The study door stood before us, closed and silent, keeping its own counsel. Holmes's hand rested briefly upon the handle before he turned it, and we stepped into the chamber where Sir Lionel Harcourt had drawn his final breath. Chapter 3. The Fatal Evening. The study was a chamber of considerable size, lined with bookcases of dark oak that rose nearly to the ceiling. A large window overlooking the square admitted what pale light the morning offered, falling upon a handsome escritoire positioned to take advantage of the natural illumination. The room spoke of scholarship and quiet industry, yet there hung about it now an atmosphere of finality, as though the very air acknowledged that its occupant would not return. Holmes stood upon the threshold for a long moment, his keen eyes sweeping across the scene with that comprehensive glance I had witnessed so many times before. He made no immediate move to enter, but rather remained motionless, absorbing every detail of the arrangement before him. "Describe for me, if you will, Mr. Mallory," he said at length, "the exact circumstances under which Sir Lionel was discovered." Mallory had followed us to the doorway, and now spoke with the careful precision of one recounting events he had heard described multiple times. "It was Miss Finch who found him, Mr. Holmes, at approximately 7:30 on the evening in question. Sir Lionel had dined early and retired to his study at 6 o'clock, saying he had correspondence to attend to. When he failed to appear for his customary coffee at 7:30, Miss Finch came to inquire whether he wished for a tray to be sent up. She knocked twice without receiving answer. Growing concerned, she entered and found him as you see there." He gestured toward the chair before the escritoire, though of course the chair was now empty. He was slumped forward slightly, his right hand still resting upon the desk beside the document. Dr. Rowan was summoned immediately and pronounced him dead. The police were called as a matter of course, though it was evident from the first that no foul play was suspected. Holmes stepped into the room at last, moving with that peculiar deliberation that characterized his methods. He approached the desk from an oblique angle rather than directly, as though unwilling to disturb some invisible arrangement of evidence that only he could perceive. The escritoire itself was a beautiful piece of furniture, its writing surface covered in tooled leather, now faded slightly with use. Upon it rested an inkwell of cut crystal, a pen stand holding several pens, and a blotter of burgundy leather. To one side lay a neat stack of writing paper, and in the centre, positioned with almost ceremonial formality, lay the document that had brought us here. Holmes made no move to touch it immediately, but instead circled the desk slowly, his eyes moving from object to object with intense concentration. He examined the chair from various angles, tested its height, and even knelt to inspect the carpet beneath it. I had seen him employ such thoroughness before, yet I confess I could not fathom what particular significance these mundane details might hold. "The letter was sealed?" he inquired. "Yes," replied Mallory, "in an envelope addressed to Lady Harcourt, though not fastened. The confession itself was folded within." "And where precisely did the envelope lie?" "Just there, beneath his right hand, Mr. Holmes, as though he had placed it there in his final moment." Holmes produced his lens and bent low over the desk, examining the leather surface with minute attention. He studied the inkwell, unstopped it briefly to examine its contents, and then turned his attention to the blotter. Here he paused for some time, his lens moving slowly across the unmarked surface. "Curious," he murmured, so softly I barely heard him. At last he took up the document itself, handling it with the delicacy one might accord to something fragile and precious. It was written upon heavy paper of excellent quality, the kind favoured by persons of means for important correspondence. The handwriting was strong and clear, the lines carefully composed. At the bottom, the signature stood bold and unmistakable. Holmes carried the paper to the window, holding it up to the light and examining it from various angles. He ran his fingers lightly across the surface, brought it close to his face as though testing for some faint odour, and finally laid it upon the windowsill while he examined the envelope with equal care. "You have read the confession, I presume?" he asked Mallory. "I have, Mr. Holmes. It alleges that Sir Lionel, in his capacity as a judge some 20 years ago, was influenced by financial considerations in rendering a verdict in a case of commercial fraud. The language is frank, the admission complete. It is precisely the sort of revelation that would destroy his legacy entirely." "And yet you doubt its authenticity?" "I doubt the circumstances, Mr. Holmes. The signature I cannot question, nor the handwriting. But the Sir Lionel anew would never have made such an admission for a crime he had not committed. If these allegations were true, why maintain his innocence so vigorously just days before his death?" Holmes returned to the desk, this time examining the pen stand with particular attention. He lifted each pen in turn, held them to the light, and inspected their nibs with his lens. One pen in particular seemed to interest him, though I could not discern what had caught his notice. "Which pen did Sir Lionel habitually use for correspondence?" he asked. "The one with the gold band, I believe," said Mallory. "He was quite particular about his writing instruments." Holmes set down the pen and turned his attention once more to the blotter. "This blotter appears entirely unmarked," he observed. "No impression of recent writing, no stray ink marks. Yet Sir Lionel supposedly composed a lengthy confession while seated at this very desk." "Perhaps he used the previous blotter and it has been discarded," I suggested. "Perhaps," said Holmes, though his tone suggested he found this explanation inadequate. "Tell me, Mr. Mallory, was the window open or closed when Sir Lionel was discovered?" "Closed, I believe, though I was not present at the actual discovery." "And the gas lamps, were they lit?" "Yes, both the desk lamp and the wall sconces. The room was well illuminated." Holmes crossed to the window and examined the latch, then moved along the wall inspecting the gas fixtures. His behaviour seemed to me increasingly eccentric, yet I held my peace, knowing from long experience that he was following some chain of reasoning visible only to himself. A knock at the door interrupted his examination. The butler entered with a card upon a silver tray. "Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard, madam. He wishes to speak with Mr. Holmes." "Show him up," said Holmes, and I detected in his voice a note of satisfaction, as though he had been expecting this development. Inspector Gregson was an officer with whom we had dealt on several occasions, a man of solid competence if limited imagination. He entered the study with an expression of professional courtesy that did not quite conceal a certain impatience. "Mr. Holmes," he said, nodding to each of us in turn. "Dr. Watson. I might have known this matter would attract your attention. Lady Harcourt has the right to seek whatever counsel she wishes, of course, though I confess I'm at a loss to understand what additional light can be shed upon what seems a straightforward if tragic case." "You're satisfied, then, that Sir Lionel took his own life?" asked Holmes. "Not took his own life in the conventional sense," replied Gregson carefully. "The medical evidence is clear that death resulted from cardiac arrest. But the emotional shock of composing such a confession, of finally unburdening himself of guilt long suppressed, that shock was sufficient to bring on the fatal attack. Dr. Rowan confirms that extreme emotional distress could precipitate such an event in a man of Sir Lionel's condition." "And the handwriting experts?" inquired Holmes. "3 separate authorities have examined the document, Mr. Holmes. All confirm that both the handwriting and signature are genuine, with no evidence of forgery or coercion. The paper bears Sir Lionel's personal watermark, the ink matches that in his own inkwell. Every material, particular supports the conclusion that this confession was written by Sir Lionel Harcourt's own hand in this very room on the evening of his death. Holmes had returned to the window and stood gazing out at the square below, his profile sharp against the pale light. "And motive?" he asked. "What do you suppose drove a man of Sir Lionel's reputation to make such a devastating admission?" "Conscience, Mr. Holmes," said Gregson with conviction. "The weight of old sins grown unbearable with age. It's not uncommon. Men who have built their lives upon foundations of deception sometimes find, at the end, that they cannot face eternity with such burdens unconfessed." "A comforting theory," observed Holmes, turning back to face us. "It has the merit of conforming to our moral expectations. The guilty are punished by their own consciences, justice is served, and society's faith in ultimate accountability is preserved." "You doubt it?" asked Gregson, his tone sharpening. "I doubt nothing." "And believe nothing until I have examined all the evidence," replied Holmes. "At present I am merely gathering impressions." Gregson's expression suggested he found this response unsatisfactory, but he had dealt with Holmes sufficiently often to know that pressing for conclusions would be futile. He took his leave shortly thereafter, reminding us that the case was officially closed pending only the final disposition of the confession itself. When we were alone once more, I turned to Holmes with barely suppressed curiosity. "Well?" I asked. "What do you make of it?" Holmes stood before the desk, his hands clasped behind his back, studying the arrangement of objects upon its surface, as though they formed some cryptic text awaiting translation. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost musing. "I make of it, Watson, that we are being presented with a tableau rather than a scene, an arrangement calculated to convey a particular narrative. The question is whether that narrative corresponds to reality or whether it has been carefully constructed to serve some purpose quite distinct from truth." He moved toward the door, pausing to cast one final glance at the escritoire. "There is something wrong here, Watson, something that offends against both logic and the natural order of things, but to prove it, I shall need to examine evidence of a rather different character than what this room provides." As we descended the stairs, I found myself troubled by doubts. The evidence seemed conclusive, the expert satisfied, the explanation plausible. Yet Holmes had perceived something amiss, some detail or absence of detail that had awakened his suspicions. I could only trust that time would reveal what his remarkable faculties had already begun to discern. Chapter 4. Ink, Paper, and Silence. Upon our return to Baker Street, Holmes immediately set about transforming our sitting room into something approximating a chemical laboratory. The confession, which Lady Harcourt had entrusted to his care with evident reluctance, was laid upon our table beneath the full light of the window. Around it Holmes assembled an array of instruments, his powerful lens, various bottles of reagent, a microscope, and several sheets of blank paper for comparison purposes. For the better part of an hour he worked in complete silence, moving between microscope and lens, occasionally making notes in that cramped hand he employed when recording observations. I occupied myself with the morning papers, though I confess my attention wandered frequently to my companion's absorbed figure. There was something almost ritualistic in his concentration, as though he were attempting to divine meaning from sacred text. At length he straightened, removed the lens from his eye, and crossed to the window where he stood motionless, staring down at the street below. I recognized this as a signal that he had completed his initial examination and was now synthesizing his observations. "Well, Holmes," I ventured, "what does your analysis reveal?" He turned from the window and I was struck by the intensity of his expression. "It reveals, Watson, a paradox. The handwriting is flawless, the signature impeccable. Indeed, I should say they are altogether too perfect for a man in the throes of mortal confession." "Too perfect?" I echoed. "Surely consistency of hand suggests authenticity rather than deception." "Ordinarily, yes," he conceded, returning to the table. "But consider the circumstances. Miss Finch observed that Sir Lionel's hand had grown unsteady in his final weeks, that he complained of tremors, yet this document displays no such infirmity. Every letter is formed with precision, every line maintains its horizontal integrity. The signature especially exhibits a firmness and confidence that seems incompatible with advanced heart disease and emotional extremity. He invited me to examine the document through his lens. Under magnification, the handwriting did indeed appear remarkably controlled, each character formed with almost mechanical regularity. Yet to my untrained eye, this seemed merely evidence of careful composition rather than grounds for suspicion. Perhaps the act of confession steadied him, I suggested. The relief of unburdening a guilty conscience might have produced a temporary calm. A psychological theory, said Holmes with a faint smile. You're entering my brother Mycroft's territory, Watson. But observe this, he indicated a section of the paper near the signature. Do you see these faint marks? They are barely visible to the naked eye, yet under magnification they become quite apparent. The paper shows subtle abrasions, as though something has been scraped or rubbed against the surface with delicate pressure. I peered through the lens at the area he indicated. Indeed, there were marks, though so slight that I should never have noticed them without Holmes's direction. What could cause such abrasions? That is the question, he replied. They are not consistent with ordinary writing or even with erasure. They suggest rather some process of transfer or impression. He lifted the paper to his nose, inhaling deeply. And there is a scent, Watson. Faint but distinctive. Not the ordinary odour of ink and paper. I attempted the same experiment but could detect nothing beyond a vague mustiness. Holmes, however, seemed satisfied with his olfactory investigation. He crossed to his chemistry table and began preparing various solutions, explaining as he worked that he intended to test the ink composition. The document was supposedly written with Sir Lionel's own materials, he said, carefully applying a drop of reagent to a corner of a comparison sheet. Yet ink varies considerably in its chemical makeup. If we find discrepancies, it would suggest the confession was not written where it was found. His chemical tests occupied another half-hour, during which time Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor. It was Inspector Gregson, looking considerably more satisfied than when we had last seen him. "I thought you'd like to know, Mr. Holmes," he said, accepting the chair I offered, "that we've established a clear motive for Sir Lionel's confession. Lady Harcourt, after some initial reluctance, has provided us with certain private correspondence that puts the matter beyond doubt." Holmes set aside his reagents with evident interest. "Indeed? What has she revealed?" Gregson drew a folded letter from his pocket. "This was found among Lady Harcourt's personal papers. It's dated 3 weeks before Sir Lionel's death, and was written by him to her, though apparently never sent. In it, he speaks of old mistakes coming back to haunt him, of enemies from his past seeking to destroy his reputation. He expresses fear that exposure is inevitable, and that scandal will touch not only himself but his family." He handed the letter to Holmes, who read it with close attention, before passing it to me. The handwriting was unmistakably the same as that of the confession, though here I could detect a slight irregularity in the formation of certain letters, a tremor that the lens had not revealed in the confession itself. "You see," said Gregson with satisfaction. The man was tormented by guilty knowledge. He feared exposure was imminent and chose to make a full confession on his own terms, rather than face public accusation. The emotional strain brought on the heart attack that killed him. It's tragic, certainly, but perfectly comprehensible. "Comprehensible?" repeated Holmes, returning the letter. "Yes, Inspector, it is certainly that. Tell me, has Lady Harcourt indicated any knowledge of the specific incident to which her husband referred?" "She believes it concerns the Warrington fraud case of 1875, replied Gregson. "Sir Lionel presided over that trial as a circuit judge. The verdict was controversial at the time, with suggestions that the defendant, wealthy manufacturer, had secured an unjust acquittal through influence. Nothing was ever proven, but the whispers persisted. Lady Harcourt thinks someone connected to that case has been attempting to extort a confession from Sir Lionel." and yet no demand for money was made?" inquired Holmes. "Not that we've discovered," admitted Gregson, "but the confession itself names no blackmailer. Perhaps Sir Lionel chose to act preemptively, to control the narrative before it could be controlled for him." After Gregson's departure, Holmes resumed his chemical analysis with renewed vigour. I watched him work, troubled by the accumulating evidence that seemed to support the official conclusion. The letter to Lady Harcourt appeared genuine and damning. The confession matched it in tone and apparent circumstance. The medical evidence was unambiguous, yet Holmes remained sceptical, his attention fixed upon minute details that to me seemed inconsequential. "The ink," he announced at last, "contains traces of a drying agent, a substance added to prevent smudging. Such additives are not uncommon in commercial inks, but they are rarely found in the personal writing materials of private individuals. Sir Lionel's regular inkwell contains a pure lamp-black suspension, as one would expect from a gentleman of his generation. Could he not have used a different ink for this particular document?" I suggested. "Perhaps something purchased specifically for the purpose." "Perhaps," said Holmes, though his tone conveyed doubt. "And yet Miss Finch mentioned no such purchase, nor did the study contain any ink bottle save the one we observed. The inference, Watson, is that the confession was written with ink not present in Sir Lionel's possession. He gathered the various sheets and specimens he had prepared, filing them carefully in an envelope. "I shall need to consult certain technical references," he said. "There are aspects of this matter that require specialist knowledge, beyond my own competence." "You believe the confession is forged?" I asked directly. Holmes paused, considering his words with care. "I believe, Watson, that what appears to be Sir Lionel's handwriting may indeed be his handwriting, that what appears to be his signature may indeed be his signature, and yet I believe also that the document as a whole is a fabrication, a construction designed to serve a purpose quite separate from the unburdening of conscience." "But how can both things be true?" I protested. "Either the man wrote the confession or he did not." "The question," said Holmes quietly, "is not whether he wrote it, but when and under what circumstances, and whether the writing found its way onto that particular paper by his own volition, or through some other agency entirely." He would say no more on the subject that evening, retiring instead to his bedroom with several volumes on chemistry and forensic science. I was left to ponder the contradiction he had posed, a riddle that seemed to violate the basic principles of logic. How could a genuine signature appear on a false document? How could authentic handwriting serve a fraudulent purpose? The fog had returned to Baker Street by nightfall, pressing against our windows like some living presence. I drew the curtains against it and sat before the fire, the various pieces of evidence arranging and rearranging themselves in my mind without achieving any coherent pattern. Somewhere in the grey labyrinth of London the truth lay waiting to be discovered. But whether that truth would vindicate Sir Lionel's memory or confirm his guilt, I could not begin to guess. Only Holmes, working by lamplight in the room above, seemed confident that the mystery would yield to patient analysis. I could hear the occasional creak of floorboards as he paced, the rustle of pages being turned, the scratch of pen on paper as he made his calculations. For him the game was still very much afoot, and the fog that obscured the truth from ordinary vision was beginning, I hoped, to clear before his singular powers of observation and deduction. Chapter 5. Voices that do not agree. The following afternoon found us once again at the Harcourt residence, though our visit on this occasion had a rather different character from the first. Holmes had requested private audiences with each of the principals in turn, and Lady Harcourt, though clearly taxed by the repeated intrusion into her grief, had acquiesced with that same dignified forbearance she had shown throughout. We began with Miss Finch, whom Holmes interviewed in the small morning room where we had first met Lady Harcourt. The secretary entered with quiet composure, her hands folded before her in that characteristic gesture I had noted previously. Yet there was about her now a certain wariness, as though she'd come to understand that Holmes's questions penetrated deeper than mere surface courtesy. "Miss Finch," Holmes began, his manner gentle and almost apologetic, I must ask you to cast your mind back over the final weeks of Sir Lionel's life. You mentioned yesterday that his hand had become less steady. Can you describe for me the progression of this condition?" She settled into her chair, considering the question with evident care. "It began, I should say, about a month before his death. At first it was barely noticeable, just a slight irregularity in his script, but it worsened rather rapidly. By the middle of October, he was complaining that the pen felt awkward in his grasp, and his response to this difficulty. He was frustrated, Mr. Holmes, as one might expect of a man who had always prided himself on his elegant hand. He began dictating more frequently to me, particularly for formal correspondence. For his personal writing, he simply ceased." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "When did he last write anything in your presence?" Miss Finch's brow furrowed in concentration. "It would have been the week before his death." He attempted to compose a reply to a letter from the Lord Chancellor, but abandoned the effort after a few lines. He asked me to draft a response for his approval instead. "And in those final days, the days immediately preceding his death, did you observe him writing at all?" "No, sir," she replied firmly. "He spent most of his time reading or sitting quietly in thought. His tremor had become quite pronounced by then. I noticed it particularly in his teacup, how he steadied it with both hands." "Yet the confession bears no trace of such infirmity," observed Holmes quietly. Miss Finch met his gaze directly. "I have thought of little else, Mr. Holmes. I cannot reconcile what I observed with what was found, and yet I am told by experts that the handwriting is genuine. Tell me, Miss Finch, did Sir Lionel ever speak to you of the Warrington case?" A shadow crossed her features, only once, and then obliquely. "He said that old sins had a way of refusing to remain buried, that even justice honestly administered might be misinterpreted by those who sought grounds for accusation. I understood him to mean that his integrity was being questioned regarding some past decision." Holmes thanked her and dismissed her with courteous warmth. As she departed, I remarked that her testimony seemed to support his theory of forgery, yet he merely nodded absently, already preparing for his next interview. Dr. Rowan arrived punctually, his medical bag once again accompanying him, as though he could not conceive of moving through the world without it. He took the chair Miss Finch had vacated, arranging himself with the practised ease of one accustomed to consultations. "Dr. Rowan," said Holmes, "you spoke yesterday of Sir Lionel's cardiac condition. I wonder if you might provide somewhat more specific detail regarding the nature and progression of his illness." Rowan shifted slightly, a gesture that might have indicated discomfort or merely the search for a comfortable position. "Sir Lionel suffered from atherosclerotic disease of the coronary arteries, a condition common in men of his age and constitution. The angina he experienced was a consequence of inadequate blood flow to the heart muscle, and his prognosis guarded," replied Rowan carefully. "With proper rest and management of stress, such patients may live for years, but any severe emotional shock or physical exertion could precipitate a fatal attack." "Did you treat him for nervous tremor?" The question seemed to catch Rowan off guard. "Tremor? No, I was not aware of any such symptom. He never mentioned it to me." "Yet Miss Finch observed it regularly in his final weeks," said Holmes mildly. "A tremor sufficiently pronounced to interfere with his writing." Rowan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Patients do not always report all their symptoms, Mr. Holmes. Sir Lionel was a proud man who may have considered such difficulties beneath medical notice. Or perhaps," suggested Holmes, "the tremor was of such recent onset that he had not yet mentioned it at your last consultation. When did you last examine him?" "A week before his death," said Rowan. "He complained of chest pain and shortness of breath. I adjusted his medication and advised complete rest." "And you observed nothing unusual in his manner? No indication of overwhelming stress or guilty preoccupation?" "Sir Lionel was always somewhat reserved in his communications with me," replied Rowan. "I tended to his physical symptoms, not his spiritual state." Holmes dismissed him soon after, and we were left alone for several minutes before our final interview. I remarked that Rowan had seemed evasive, but Holmes cautioned against premature judgment. Medical men are trained to maintain certain boundaries, Watson. What appears as evasion may be merely professional discretion. Edwin Mallory arrived last, carrying a leather folder which he explained contained copies of various documents. From his firm's files, he had, he said, taken the liberty of assembling materials that might prove relevant to our investigation. "Most helpful," said Holmes, accepting the folder. "Mr. Mallory, you have been remarkably cooperative throughout this inquiry. I confess myself curious as to your particular interest in this matter." Mallory seemed slightly taken aback by the directness of the question. "Sir Lionel was not merely an author under contract to our firm, Mr. Holmes. He was a friend and mentor. The thought that his reputation might be unjustly tarnished troubles me deeply. And if the confession proves genuine, if Sir Lionel was indeed guilty of the improprieties alleged, then I should wish to know that as well," replied Mallory steadily. "Truth, Mr. Holmes, whatever its character, is preferable to uncertainty." Holmes opened the folder and examined its contents briefly. "You have provided timelines, correspondence records, publication schedules, most thorough. Tell me, did Sir Lionel conduct business directly with you, or did he work primarily through Miss Finch?" "Both, actually. For routine matters, Miss Finch served as intermediary. But for significant decisions regarding publication, Sir Lionel and I met directly. We had luncheon together a fortnight before his death to discuss his next volume." "And his state of mind on that occasion?" Mallory considered the question thoughtfully. "Preoccupied, I should say. Not his usual self. When I inquired whether something troubled him, he deflected the question with that courteous evasion he had perfected over years on the bench." "Did he mention the Warrington case?" "Not by name, but he did make a rather curious remark. He said that the past was like a manuscript that could never be truly destroyed, that even burned pages left their impression on subsequent sheets. I took it as a philosophical observation at the time, but in retrospect—" Holmes closed the folder and set it aside. "You have been most generous with your time and resources, Mr. Mallory. One final question, if I may. Your firm specialises in legal and scholarly publications, does it not?" "That is correct. We maintain the highest standards of printing and presentation." "And your inks. I imagine a publishing house employs various specialised formulations for different purposes." "Indeed," said Mallory, apparently puzzled by the question. "We use several varieties depending on the application. For proofs and advance copies, we employ quick-drying inks that prevent smudging during handling. For final editions, rather different formulations." "Fascinating," murmured Holmes. "The chemistry of printing is a subject that has always intrigued me." After Mallory's departure, Holmes sat for some time in silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, in that attitude of concentration I knew so well. The winter daylight was fading beyond the windows, and shadows gathered in the corners of the room. "Well?" I asked at length. "What have we learned?" Holmes stirred, as though waking from deep thought. "We have learned, Watson, that truth is a mosaic composed of individual testimonies, and that sometimes the picture emerges not from what each piece shows, but from the pattern of gaps between them." "You speak in riddles, Holmes." "Do I?" He smiled faintly. "Perhaps. But consider. Miss Finch swears Sir Lionel could not write in his final days. Dr. Rowan knew nothing of this tremor. Lady Harcourt received a letter suggesting guilty fears. And Mr. Mallory, helpful Mr. Mallory, provides us with everything we might need to pursue our investigation, including specialised knowledge of printing inks." "You surely don't suspect Mallory," I protested. "He has been the soul of cooperation." "Cooperation," repeated Holmes softly. "Yes, Watson, he has indeed been most cooperative. The question is why?" He rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening square. "We shall call upon Scotland Yard tomorrow. There are inquiries to be made regarding the Warrington case, and I find I should like to know rather more about the various parties involved. The past, as Mallory so aptly observed, leaves its impression on subsequent sheets. it is time we examined those impressions with rather greater care. As we made our way back to Baker Street through streets now alive with evening traffic, I found myself troubled by doubts. The testimonies we had gathered seemed to raise more questions than they answered, and I could not perceive what pattern Holmes had detected in their contradictions. Yet I knew better than to press him for explanations before he was ready to provide them. The truth, when it came, would emerge complete and undeniable. Until then, I could only trust in his methods and await developments with what patience I could muster. Chapter 6. The Study Reconstructed. Holmes had obtained permission from Lady Harcourt to return to Sir Lionel's study under rather unusual conditions. He wished, he explained, to examine the room alone and undisturbed for several hours, conducting certain experiments that required both privacy and concentration. Lady Harcourt, though clearly perplexed by this request, granted it without demur, and so we found ourselves admitted to the silent house on a grey afternoon 3 days after our initial visit. The study appeared exactly as we had last seen it, preserved by Lady Harcourt's instruction as a kind of shrine to her husband's memory. The escritoire stood in its accustomed place, the chair positioned before it at the precise angle we had observed previously. Even the air seemed unchanged, carrying that faint scent of leather and old paper that characterizes rooms devoted to scholarship. Holmes entered with an air of quiet purpose, carrying a leather case that contained various items he had assembled at Baker Street. He set this upon a side table and stood for a moment surveying the room with that comprehensive gaze I had witnessed so often. "Watson," he said at length, "I am going to ask you to serve as observer and chronicler for the next few hours. I shall conduct a series of experiments, some of which may appear quite purposeless to you. I ask only that you note what I do and refrain from questions until I have completed my work." I assured him of my cooperation and settled into a chair near the window where I could observe without interfering. Holmes acknowledged this with a brief nod and then, quite deliberately, seemed to forget my presence entirely. He began by seating himself in Sir Lionel's chair, adjusting its height with minute precision. He sat perfectly still for several minutes, his eyes moving methodically across the desktop, the window, the bookcases visible in his peripheral vision. He reached for an imaginary pen, positioning his hand as though preparing to write, then withdrew it and adjusted the chair fractionally to the left. The process was repeated with tiny modifications each time until he appeared satisfied with some equilibrium invisible to me. From his case he produced several sheets of paper identical in weight and quality to that upon which the confession had been written. These he had procured, he had mentioned earlier, from a stationer who supplied the same manufacturer. He placed one sheet upon the desk at the precise angle the confession had lain, securing it with paperweights at its corners. Next came a series of experiments with light. Holmes rose and moved about the room, noting the position of gas fixtures and the quality of illumination they provided. He lit one lamp, then another, extinguished them in the various combinations, observing how shadows fell upon the desk. He drew the curtains partially closed, then opened them fully. At each stage he returned to the chair and examined how the altered light affected the writing surface. The experiments with ink proved more elaborate. Holmes had brought several bottles of ink from Baker Street, including samples of various commercial formulations. He prepared the steel pens from Sir Lionel's desk, testing each nib for flexibility and flow. Then, with meticulous care, he wrote identical passages on separate sheets, using different inks and varying the pressure of his hand. Each sample was dated and labelled, then set aside to dry under specific conditions he had apparently predetermined. I watched as he produced a small spirit lamp and heated portions of the paper samples, observing how different inks responded to warmth. He applied chemical solutions to corners of the sheets, making notes of reactions. Some portions of paper he moistened slightly, others he left dry, and upon these he tested how ink absorbed under varying conditions of humidity. Throughout this process he maintained an almost meditative silence, broken only by occasional murmurs as he recorded observations. There was something hypnotic in the methodical nature of his work, the careful repetition of procedures with minute variations. I found myself mesmerized by the precision of his movements, the absolute concentration he brought to tasks that seemed, to my untrained eye, to yield little obvious information. After perhaps 2 hours, Holmes turned his attention to the blotter. He examined it again under his lens, then retrieved from his case what appeared to be similar blotters in various stages of use. These he compared minutely, testing their absorbency with drops of ink and water. He pressed the pen nibs into the blotter at various angles, observing what impressions they left or failed to leave. "Curious," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Most curious indeed." He rose and crossed to the window, where he stood examining the latch and hinges with particular attention. He opened and closed the window several times, noting the ease of its movement. From the window he proceeded to inspect the fireplace, the carpet beneath and around the desk, even the undersides of nearby furniture. Nothing, it seemed, escaped his scrutiny. The chair received special attention. Holmes examined it from every angle, tested its stability, measured the height of its seat from the floor. He sat in it repeatedly, adjusting his posture, reaching for the desk at different angles. At one point he produced a tape measure and recorded various distances with scrupulous precision. As the afternoon light began to fail, Holmes lit the gas lamps as they would have been lit on the evening of Sir Lionel's death. He returned to the chair and sat with his eyes closed, his breathing deep and regular, as though attempting to inhabit the space Sir Lionel had occupied in his final moments. When he opened his eyes at last, his expression had changed. Where before there had been mere concentration, now I detected something approaching certainty. He gathered his samples and instruments, packing them carefully into his case. Only then did he turn to me, and I saw in his face that peculiar satisfaction that indicated a problem solved. "You have been admirably patient, Watson," he said. "Your notes will prove invaluable when I present my conclusions, but tell me, what have you observed?" I consulted the pages I'd filled with descriptions of his various experiments. "You have tested inks, examined papers, studied the arrangement of furniture and lighting. You appear particularly interested in the blotter's unused condition and in certain physical aspects of the chair and desk arrangement." "Excellent," said Holmes. "And what conclusion do you draw from these observations?" I confess I was at a loss. "That you seek to determine whether the confession could have been written under the conditions found in this room?" "Precisely, Watson, and the answer I can now state with confidence is that it could not. The signature, that perfect, unwavering signature, was not executed at this desk, in this light, by a man seated in this chair. The physical evidence renders such a conclusion impossible." "But Holmes," I protested, "if the signature is genuine, as every expert attests, where else could it have been written?" He moved to the desk and rested his hand upon its surface. "That is the essential question, is it not? And in answering it, we must consider not merely the mechanics of writing, but the purpose behind the document. Why would someone wish the world to believe Sir Lionel had confessed to judicial corruption? To destroy his reputation, I suggested, to discredit his legacy. That is one possibility, Holmes agreed, but consider the alternative. What if the purpose was not to destroy Sir Lionel's reputation, but to ensure his silence? What if someone feared that Sir Lionel, far from confessing to old sins, was preparing to reveal new ones, sins not his own, but belonging to another? The idea struck me with considerable force. "You believe he was murdered?" "I believe he died of natural causes, Holmes." "Corrected. The medical evidence supports no other conclusion, but I believe also that his death was convenient for someone, and that the confession was manufactured to provide a posthumous motive for that death. Not murder, Watson, but something in some ways more insidious. The death of reputation serves where the death of body proves unnecessary." He closed his case with decisive finality. The signature was real, the handwriting authentic, but they were obtained through deception and applied through artifice. Someone with access to Sir Lionel's past correspondence, someone with knowledge of specialised printing techniques, someone who stood to lose everything if Sir Lionel testified against them. That someone created this elaborate fiction to silence a man whose integrity threatened their own preservation. But who? I asked. And how? Holmes smiled, though there was no humour in the expression. The who becomes evident when we understand the how, Watson, and the how is a matter of chemistry, not violence, of transferred ink, not wielded pen, of professional knowledge applied to criminal purpose. We descended the stairs in silence, leaving the study to its shadows and secrets. As we emerged into the damp evening air, I found myself oppressed by the weight of Holmes's revelations. The truth he had uncovered was more subtle than simple forgery, more disturbing than straightforward murder. Someone had wielded Sir Lionel's own hand against him, turning his integrity into apparent guilt through means I could not yet comprehend. "Tomorrow," said Holmes as our cab rattled toward Baker Street, "we shall examine the testimony of documents that no longer exist. We shall trace the provenance of paper and ink, and we shall determine precisely how a man's signature can appear on a confession he never wrote. The technical details remain to be established, Watson, but the essential truth is now clear. Sir Lionel Harcourt was not felled by guilty conscience, but by someone else's guilty fear." The fog had returned, thick and impenetrable, swallowing the streets in grey obscurity. Somewhere in that murk a criminal walked free, believing their elaborate deception had succeeded. But Sherlock Holmes had penetrated the illusion, and the reckoning would not be long delayed. Chapter 7. The Theory of Despair. Inspector Gregson arrived at Baker Street the following morning with an air of professional satisfaction that bordered on triumph. He carried a thick folder of documents and was accompanied by a gentleman whom he introduced as Mr. Arthur Pemberton, a handwriting expert of considerable reputation who had examined the confession at Scotland Yard's request. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Gregson began, settling into the chair Holmes indicated, "I believe we have now assembled a complete picture of Sir Lionel Harcourt's final days. With your permission, I should like to present our findings in full." Holmes, who had been occupied with his morning correspondence, set aside his letters and gave Gregson his complete attention. "By all means, Inspector. I'm most eager to hear your conclusions." Gregson opened his folder with the careful precision of a man marshalling evidence for presentation. "We begin with the Warrington fraud case of 1875. Sir Lionel, then a circuit judge of just 3 years' standing, presided over the trial of Marcus Warrington, accused of defrauding investors through false prospectuses. The case was complex, the evidence largely circumstantial. Sir Lionel's verdict of acquittal was controversial and drew immediate criticism from certain quarters." "The acquittal was legally sound," interjected Mr. Pemberton. "I have reviewed the trial transcripts. Sir Lionel's reasoning was thorough and his application of law correct. Yet the appearance of impropriety persisted, fueled by the fact that Warrington subsequently contributed to various legal charities that Sir Lionel supported. Contributions that were entirely proper and transparent," added Gregson, "but which provided ammunition for those who wished to suggest corruption. For nearly 20 years Sir Lionel lived with these whispers, building a reputation of unimpeachable integrity that eventually silenced most critics, until this autumn, when someone began a campaign of harassment. He produced a series of letters, laying them upon our table with deliberate care. These were found among Sir Lionel's private papers, which Lady Harcourt has now permitted us to examine fully. They are unsigned, but their message is clear. The writer claims to possess evidence that Sir Lionel accepted financial inducement to acquit Warrington. The writer demands a full public confession, threatening exposure if Sir Lionel refuses. I examined the letters with growing dismay. They were brief, their language calculated to wound. Each one escalated the pressure slightly, moving from veiled suggestion to explicit threat. The final letter, dated a week, before Sir Lionel's death gave him 3 days to comply. "Obviously fabricated accusations," said Holmes. "Blackmail based upon nothing more substantial than old gossip." "Precisely our conclusion," agreed Gregson, "but consider the effect on Sir Lionel's state of mind. Here was a man whose entire life had been devoted to the law, whose reputation was his most precious possession. Suddenly he found himself confronting accusations that, however false, could not be definitively disproven. The alleged payment from Warrington could not be documented because it never occurred. But how does one prove a negative? How does one establish that money was not received 20 years ago?" Mr. Pemberton leaned forward. "The psychological burden, gentlemen, would have been immense." Sir Lionel faced an impossible choice. Ignore the blackmail and risk public accusation, or attempt to refute charges that rested upon the very absence of evidence. Either path led to scandal and the destruction of everything he had built. "And so," continued Gregson, "he chose a third way. He would make a confession, but on his own terms. He would frame the narrative himself rather than allow his enemies to do so. The confession we recovered is carefully worded. It admits to anxiety about the appearance of impropriety, to concern that his judgment might have been unconsciously influenced by subsequent donations, to fear that his verdict might have been wrong. But it never directly admits to accepting a bribe or to any criminal act." Holmes had taken up the confession and was reading it with renewed attention. I confess that, seeing it through the lens Gregson now provided, the document appeared in a different light. What had seemed a damning admission might be read as a more nuanced statement, one that acknowledged doubt without admitting guilt. "The handwriting analysis," prompted Holmes. Mr. Pemberton drew forth his own report. "I've examined the confession alongside verified exemplars of Sir Lionel's hand spanning 20 years. The conclusion is unambiguous. Every aspect of the writing is consistent with Sir Lionel's established hand. The letter formations, the spacing, the pressure variations, the characteristic flourishes, all are present and correct. This document was written by Sir Lionel Harcourt, of that I have no professional doubt whatsoever." "And the signature?" asked Holmes quietly. "Especially the signature," affirmed Pemberton. "It bears every hallmark of Sir Lionel's authentic hand. The angle of ascent, the proportions, the terminal stroke, these are elements that are virtually impossible to forge convincingly, yet here they appear in perfect fidelity to his known signature." Gregson resumed his narrative. "We believe that Sir Lionel composed this confession over several days, perhaps a week, carefully choosing his words. On the evening of his death, he placed it in an envelope addressed to Lady Harcourt, intending perhaps to leave it unsealed so that he might reconsider. The act of finality, of committing this admission to paper in its completed form, brought on the emotional crisis that precipitated his cardiac arrest." "Death by despair," I murmured, the phrase seeming to capture the tragedy of the scenario. "Precisely, Dr. Watson," said Gregson with grim satisfaction. "Not suicide in the legal sense. There was no violence, no self-harm, but a death nonetheless caused by overwhelming psychological trauma. The heart simply could not bear the weight of anguish that Sir Lionel experienced in that moment." Holmes had remained silent throughout this exposition, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose. Now he stirred slightly. "And the blackmailer? Have you identified this person?" Gregson's expression darkened. "We have not. The letters provide no definitive clues to authorship. They were posted from various locations about London, written in a disguised hand. Our inquiries into Sir Lionel's known. Enemies have yielded nothing conclusive. It is possible the blackmailer, seeing that his victim had died before complying with demands, has simply abandoned the scheme." "A convenient outcome," observed Holmes dryly. "Perhaps," acknowledged Gregson, "but not unprecedented. Blackmailers are inherently cowardly. With their victim dead, the leverage disappears and the risk of continued harassment outweighs any potential benefit." He gathered his papers with an air of finality. "Lady Harcourt has been apprised of our conclusions. After considerable deliberation, she has decided that the confession should remain private. known only to the immediate family and to ourselves. There is no public benefit to be gained from posthumously tarnishing Sir Lionel's reputation, particularly when the allegations were almost certainly false. The official cause of death remains cardiac arrest. No further investigation is warranted. After Gregson and Pemberton had departed, I turned to Holmes with a sense of reluctant acceptance. The case they had presented was thorough, logical, and deeply humane in its interpretation. Sir Lionel emerged not as a criminal, but as a victim, a man of conscience destroyed by false accusations he could neither prove nor disprove. It seems we must accept Scotland Yard's conclusion, I said. The evidence is overwhelming. Sir Lionel wrote the confession himself, driven by blackmail and despair, and the emotional shock killed him. It is a tragedy, certainly, but there appears no mystery to solve. Holmes had moved to the window and stood gazing down at Baker Street, his profile etched against the pale morning light. When he spoke, his voice was distant, almost contemplative. "It is a beautiful theory, Watson. Elegant, complete, and profoundly satisfying to our moral sensibilities. The innocent man brought low by false accusation, dying of a broken heart while attempting to control the narrative of his own disgrace. It has about it the quality of classical tragedy. Then you accept it." He turned to face me, and I was struck by the intensity of his gaze. "I accept that it is what Scotland Yard believes, and that it is what the evidence appears to support. I accept that it is plausible, even probable, given the facts as presented. What I do not accept, Watson, is that it is true." "But Holmes—" He raised a hand to forestall my protest. "I know, my dear fellow, every material particular supports their conclusion. The handwriting is genuine, the motive established, the psychological mechanism plausible. And yet there remains one fact that cannot be reconciled with their theory, one small detail that undermines the entire edifice of their reasoning." "What fact?" I demanded. "The untouched blotter," said Holmes simply. "A man writes a lengthy confession, the culminating document of his life, a statement upon which his entire reputation will rest. He writes it with a pen dipped in liquid ink, forming hundreds of individual letters. And yet the blotter beside which he writes, the blotter positioned precisely where a careful writer would instinctively use it, shows not one mark, not one spot of absorbed ink. It is as pristine as if Sir Lionel had never lifted a pen that evening." He returned to his chair and took up his pipe. "Scotland Yard sees what they expect to see, Watson. A complete narrative that satisfies both logic and sentiment. They are good men, honest men, and they believe they have found the truth. But truth and appearance are not always identical. And I have built my career upon the ability to distinguish between them." The case, it seemed, was not quite closed after all. Yet even I, his most loyal advocate, found myself wavering. The weight of official conclusion, the comprehensiveness of evidence, the absence of any alternative explanation, all these pressed upon my consciousness with undeniable force. If Holmes was right, he would need more than doubts about an unused blotter to prove it. He would need to demonstrate exactly how Sir Lionel's genuine handwriting had appeared on a confession the man had never written. And at that moment, sitting in our Baker Street rooms with winter light fading beyond the windows, I confess I could not imagine how even Sherlock Holmes might accomplish such a demonstration. Chapter 8. The Unimportant Detail. For 3 days following Inspector Gregson's visit, Holmes maintained a curious silence on the subject of Sir Lionel Harcourt. He spent long hours in chemical experimentation, filling our sitting room with noxious vapours and covering every available surface with samples of paper, ink, and photographic plates. When I inquired as to the nature of his research, he merely replied that he was pursuing certain technical questions that required verification before he could proceed further. On the 4th morning, he announced that we would be calling upon Mr. Frederick Osborne, a specialist in document examination whom Holmes had consulted on previous occasions. Osborne maintained offices in Chancery Lane, and we found him in a cluttered room lined with cabinets, containing what appeared to be thousands of handwriting samples, each carefully labelled and catalogued. "Mr. Holmes," said Osborne, rising to greet us, "your note mentioned a matter of some delicacy involving signature analysis. I have cleared my schedule as requested." Holmes produced the confession, which he had persuaded Lady Harcourt to entrust to him for further study. "I should like your professional opinion on this signature, Mr. Osborne. Specifically, I wish you to examine the directional characteristics of the pen strokes." Osborne adjusted his spectacles and bent over the document with a large magnifying lens. For several minutes he studied the signature in silence, occasionally making small marks on a separate sheet of paper. Holmes watched him with that peculiar stillness that indicated complete absorption. "Most interesting, Osborne," murmured at length. "The signature itself is executed with remarkable confidence. The pen has moved smoothly, without hesitation or correction. The pressure is even throughout, the formation of letters precise and controlled." "And the direction of the strokes?" prompted Holmes. "Ah, yes. The strokes follow a pattern consistent with a practised hand, each letter formed through a series of learned movements. The ascending strokes show a slight rightward bias. The descending strokes are nearly vertical. This is characteristic of a particular school of penmanship popular 40 years ago. And would such a signature be consistent with a man suffering from a pronounced tremor in his hand?" Osborne looked up sharply. "A tremor? No, Mr. Holmes, quite the opposite. A tremor would manifest in irregular pressure, wavering lines, and particularly in difficulty in maintaining the horizontal baseline. This signature shows none of those characteristics. It was written by a steady hand, or I am no judge of such matters." Holmes thanked him, and we departed, leaving Osborne clearly puzzled by our visit. As we walked back toward Baker Street, I ventured to ask what significance Holmes attached to this observation. "It confirms what we already suspected, Watson. The signature, though genuine in its formation, was not executed by Sir Lionel Harcourt in his final weeks. The hand that wrote this was steady and practised, unmarred by the tremor that Miss Finch observed so consistently. But if the signature is genuine, as every expert attests, how can it have been written by anyone other than Sir Lionel?" Holmes smiled enigmatically. "That, my dear Watson, is precisely the question we must answer. But first, one more consultation." Our next destination proved to be a printing works in Suffolk, a substantial establishment that produced books and periodicals of high quality. Holmes had arranged an appointment with the master printer, a Mr. George Ashford, who received us in his office overlooking the main floor of the works, where the rhythmic thump of presses provided a constant industrial symphony. "Mr. Holmes, you mentioned in your note an interest in printing inks," said Ashford, a robust man with ink-stained fingers and an air of professional competence. "We maintain perhaps the most comprehensive selection in London. What particular formulation interests you?" Holmes produced a small vial containing a sample of ink he had carefully extracted from the confession. "I should like you to analyse this ink and tell me its composition, particularly whether it contains any specialised additives." Ashford examined the sample with practised eye, performing several simple tests with the reagents he kept in his office. "This is a high-quality writing ink, lamp-black base with iron gall fortification. But yes, it contains a drying agent, probably a metallic salt compound. Such additives are common in commercial inks designed for rapid handling." "And in personal, writing inks?" asked Holmes. "Quite rare," replied Ashford. "Gentlemen who write with pen and ink generally allow their correspondence to dry naturally. The drying agents are used primarily in printing and publishing, where speed is essential and smudging would ruin proofs and advance copies. So this ink would most likely be found in a printing house or publishing firm. Without question, it's a professional formulation, not something one would purchase for personal use." Holmes thanked Ashford, and we emerged once more into the grey London afternoon. I could sense his excitement, though he maintained his customary reserve. "You see, Watson," he said as we hailed a cab, "the confession was written with ink that Sir Lionel would not have possessed, ink that is characteristic of the publishing trade, ink that Mr. Edwin Mallory, in his helpful way, took pains to educate us about when we interviewed him." The connection struck me with sudden force. "Good heavens, Holmes, you suspect Mallory?" "I do more than suspect, Watson. I am now virtually certain. But suspicion and certainty are insufficient. We must demonstrate precisely how the deception was accomplished." We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes immediately set about preparing a demonstration. He cleared our table and arranged upon it various materials, sheets of blank paper, several pens, bottles of ink both commercial and private, and a curious assortment of chemicals in small vials. "Observe, Watson," he said, seating himself at the table. "Suppose you possess a letter written years ago by Sir Lionel Harcourt, a perfectly innocent letter, perhaps a note of thanks or a brief instruction. This letter bears his authentic signature, written when his hand was still steady. How might you transfer that signature to a different document entirely?" "You cannot simply cut it out and paste it," I objected. "Such manipulation would be immediately obvious." "Precisely. The transfer must be chemical, not mechanical. And here is where the specialized knowledge of a publisher becomes invaluable." He took up one of the sheets and wrote a brief sentence, signing it with a flourish. "Let us imagine this is our original signature. Now, observe." From his chemicals he selected a particular solvent, which he applied carefully to the signature with a fine brush. The ink began to soften and blur slightly. Next, he pressed a second sheet of paper firmly against the first, maintaining pressure for several seconds. When he lifted the top sheet, I was astonished to see a faint impression of the signature, reversed but recognizable. "A crude transfer," Holmes explained, "but it demonstrates the principle. With proper chemicals, the right pressure and technical expertise, one could lift ink from an original signature and transfer it to a new document. The transferred signature would be genuine in every particular, because it is the actual ink from the original, merely relocated. But would such a transfer be detectable?" I asked. "Under microscopic examination, yes. The ink shows characteristics of having been impressed rather than flowed from a pen. The paper exhibits faint abrasions from the transfer process. The signature lacks the subtle variations in ink density that occur with natural writing. All these signs are present in Sir Lionel's confession, Watson. Signs that I noted during my initial examination, but whose significance became clear only when I understood the full context." He set aside his demonstration materials and fixed me with an earnest gaze. Edwin Mallory had access to Sir Lionel's past correspondence. As a publisher, he possessed the chemical knowledge to perform such a transfer. He used specialized printing house ink that would dry quickly and resist smudging during the process. And he had motive, a motive we have not yet fully established, but which I believe relates to Sir Lionel's potential testimony regarding some professional impropriety. "The Warrington case," I suggested. "Perhaps, or something else entirely, but the technical means are now clear. Mallory obtained Sir Lionel's signature from an old letter, transferred it chemically to a confession he had carefully composed in a style mimicking Sir Lionel's hand, and placed the document beside the body on the evening Sir Lionel died of natural causes. The confession was not forged in the conventional sense. It was assembled from genuine components through a process that only an expert in printing and document production would know how to execute." I sat back, my mind reeling from these revelations. What had seemed an impenetrable mystery now stood revealed as an elaborate technical fraud. Yet even as I grasped the method, I found myself troubled by remaining questions. But Holmes, if Mallory created this confession, he must have had opportunity to place it in the study after Sir Lionel's death. How could he have managed that? "An excellent question," said Holmes, rising and reaching for his coat, "and one that brings us to the most delicate aspect of this investigation. We must now determine exactly what occurred on the evening of Sir Lionel's death, and who had access to his study between the moment of death and the discovery of the body. Come, Watson, It is time we paid another visit to Belgrave Square. As we descended the stairs, I found myself experiencing that peculiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that always accompanied the approaching climax of one of Holmes's investigations. The technical mystery had been solved, the method revealed. What remained was to establish opportunity and, most crucially, motive. Why had Edwin Mallory, seemingly so cooperative and concerned for Sir Lionel's reputation, undertaken such an elaborate deception? The answer, I sensed, would prove both surprising and disturbing. Chapter 9. The Signature Exposed. Lady Harcourt received us in the drawing-room rather than the morning-room, a subtle indication that our visit was to be of a formal rather than intimate character. Present also were Miss Finch, Dr. Rowan, and, at Holmes's particular request, Mr. Edwin Mallory. Inspector Gregson had arrived shortly before us, summoned by a telegram from Holmes that had hinted at significant developments. Holmes declined Lady Harcourt's offer of refreshment and remained standing, positioning himself near the fireplace where he could address the assembled company. There was about him that electric quality I had come to recognise as the prelude to revelation, that peculiar intensity that transformed him from mere man into something approaching a force of nature. "Lady Harcourt, gentlemen," he began, "I have asked you here because a grave injustice has been done, not only to Sir Lionel's memory, but to the very concept of truth itself. What has been accepted as fact is in reality an elaborate deception, and what has been mourned as the tragic confession of a guilty man is actually evidence of an innocent man's murder." "Murder?" exclaimed Gregson. "But Mr. Holmes, the medical evidence—" "Is entirely accurate," Holmes interrupted smoothly. "Sir Lionel died of cardiac arrest just as Dr. Rowan certified. There was no poison, no violence, no physical agency of death beyond the failure of his own heart. And yet I maintain that he was murdered nonetheless, killed by the deliberate exploitation of his condition to achieve a calculated end." Lady Harcourt had grown very pale, but her voice remained steady. "I do not understand, Mr. Holmes. If my husband died naturally, how can you speak of murder?" "Because the confession found beside his body, the document that has been accepted as genuine by every expert who examined it, is in truth a fabrication. Not a forgery in the conventional sense, but something far more subtle. The handwriting is Sir Lionel's, the signature authentic. Yet the document itself was never written by him in the manner and circumstance. Everyone assumes," I observed Mallory closely as Holmes spoke. The publisher sat with perfect stillness, his face composed, though I fancied I detected a slight tension in his posture that had not been present before. "Let me present the facts systematically," Holmes continued. "Sir Lionel suffered in his final weeks from a tremor in his hand, a symptom observed by Miss Finch and acknowledged by his own abandonment of personal correspondence. Yet the confession displays no such tremor. Every letter is formed with perfect control. Every line maintains absolute horizontal integrity. This discrepancy first aroused my suspicion." He moved to the table where he had arranged various materials brought from Baker Street. "Next, I examined the document itself under microscopic analysis. The paper showed faint abrasions inconsistent with ordinary writing. The ink contained chemical additives used exclusively in commercial printing, not in private correspondence, and most tellingly, the confession had been written at the desk, yet the blotter beside it showed no trace of ink absorption. Gentlemen, a man does not compose the most important document of his life without once using the blotter at his hand." "These could be explained by unusual circumstances," protested Gregson, though his tone lacked conviction. "Individually, perhaps," Holmes agreed, "but collectively they pointed to a startling conclusion. The signature was genuine, but had been transferred from another document entirely. The process is technically complex, but well within the capabilities of someone versed in printing and publishing techniques. He produced a demonstration similar to the one he'd shown me, executing the chemical transfer with practiced efficiency. The assembled company watched in fascinated silence as a signature appeared on a fresh sheet of paper, indistinguishable to casual inspection from one written naturally. "This is how it was done," said Holmes, holding up the transferred signature. An old letter bearing Sir Lionel's authentic signature was treated with specialised solvents. The ink was lifted and impressed onto the confession, which had been carefully composed in a style mimicking Sir Lionel's hand. The result appears genuine because, in its individual components, it is genuine. Only the assemblage is false. "But who would possess both the knowledge and materials to accomplish such a thing?" asked Dr. Rowan. Holmes turned his gaze fully upon Mallory. Someone intimately familiar with printing techniques, someone with access to Sir Lionel's past correspondence, someone who employed specialised quick-drying inks as a matter of professional routine, someone, in short, like Mr. Edwin Mallory. The room fell into profound silence. Mallory met Holmes's gaze without flinching, though I detected a subtle shift in his expression, a hardening of features that suggested the dropping of a carefully maintained mask. "These are grave accusations, Mr. Holmes," he said quietly. "Have you any evidence beyond theoretical demonstrations and circumstantial observations?" "I have evidence of motive," replied Holmes, "which brings us to the true reason for this elaborate deception. The confession was designed to provide a retrospective justification for Sir Lionel's death, to suggest that he died from guilty despair rather than inconvenient timing. But why was it inconvenient? What did Sir Lionel know that made his continued silence so valuable? He drew from his pocket a sheaf of documents. "I have spent the past 3 days examining the commercial history of Weatherby and Sons. Specifically, I investigated a contract dispute from 15 years ago involving the publication rights to a series of legal commentaries. The dispute was settled privately, but certain irregularities in the settlement suggested possible fraud. Sir Lionel had recently requested access to the original contracts, claiming he wished to verify certain legal principles for an essay he was writing." Mallory's composure finally cracked. "This is mere speculation. You cannot prove—" "I can prove that Sir Lionel had scheduled a meeting with solicitors specialising in contractual fraud for the day following his death," Holmes interrupted. "I can prove that his firm had been on the verge of bankruptcy 15 years ago and was saved only by the favourable settlement of this particular dispute. I can prove that should Sir Lionel's examination of the contracts reveal deliberate misrepresentation, the settlement would be invalidated and your firm rendered liable for damages that would exceed its total assets." He advanced a step toward Mallory. "Sir Lionel's testimony would have destroyed everything you had built, everything your family had established over 3 generations. You could not allow him to speak, yet neither could you silence him through violence, for that would invite the very investigation you sought to avoid. So you conceived a more subtle plan. You waited for nature to take its course, knowing Sir Lionel's heart was weak, and when death came, you exploited it, planting a confession that would discredit any posthumous allegations he might have made, and that would provide a motive for his death that deflected all suspicion from yourself." "This is absurd," said Mallory, but his voice lacked force. "How could I have placed the confession in Sir Lionel's study? I was not present at his death." "But you were present shortly thereafter," countered Holmes. "You were the first person Miss Finch summoned after Dr. Rowan. You arrived before the police, during that crucial period when the study was in confusion and tension, was focused on Sir Lionel himself rather than on his desk. It would have taken but a moment to place the envelope containing the confession, a moment when all eyes were elsewhere." Miss Finch had risen from her chair, her face stricken with understanding. "It's true," she whispered. "Mr. Mallory entered the study while Dr. Rowan was examining Sir Lionel. He said he wished to pay his respects. I thought nothing of it at the time." Mallory stood abruptly, his composure finely shattered. For a moment I thought he might attempt to flee, but Holmes had positioned himself between Mallory and the door, and Inspector Gregson had risen with the instinctive readiness of an officer anticipating resistance. "You have no proof," Mallory said desperately. "The confession bears Sir Lionel's signature. Every expert has confirmed its authenticity. The signature is authentic, Holmes agreed, but it was lifted from a letter Sir Lionel wrote to you 3 years ago, a letter thanking you for your stewardship of his publications. I found the original in your office files, or rather I found where it should have been. The page preceding it and the page following it both remain, but the letter itself has vanished. You kept it because you knew you might one day need an exemplar of his signature. Signature written when his hand was still steady and firm. He produced a file containing correspondence from Mallory's office. The paper stock used for the confession matches exactly the personal stationery you commission for formal letters. The watermark, barely visible but present under proper examination, bears the manufacturer's mark identical to your firm's standard order. Every material particular ties the confession not to Sir Lionel's study, but to your place of business. Mallory sank back into his chair, and I saw all resistance drained from him. His face had become ashen, his hands trembling as they gripped the armrests. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. He would have destroyed us. 3 generations of honest publishing brought to ruin by a contractual interpretation made in desperation 15 years ago. I tried to reason with him, to explain that the settlement had been reached in good faith, that any irregularities were the result of misunderstanding, rather than fraud. He would not listen. He spoke of duty, of principle, of the absolute necessity of correcting even ancient wrongs. So you created evidence of a different ancient wrong, said Holmes quietly. You forged a narrative in which Sir Lionel himself stood accused, transforming him from accuser to guilty party, and you used his own death, a death you did not cause, but which you shamelessly exploited, to give that false narrative the weight of posthumous confession. Inspector Gregson had moved to stand beside Mallory, his hand resting lightly on the man's shoulder. Edwin Mallory, I am arresting you for fraud and for perverting the course of justice. You will need to accompany me to Scotland Yard. As Mallory was led away, his earlier composure entirely abandoned, Lady Harcourt turned to Holmes with tears glistening in her eyes. My husband's reputation will be restored? Completely, Holmes assured her. The confession will be withdrawn and destroyed. The true circumstances will be made known to those who matter. Sir Lionel's integrity remains unblemished, his legacy secure. After we had taken our leave and were once more in our cab returning to Baker Street, I reflected on the curious nature of the crime we had unravelled. No violence had been done, no life directly taken. Yet in its cold calculation, in its exploitation of death for purposes of fraud, there was something peculiarly repugnant about Mallory's scheme. A singular case, I remarked to Holmes. Murder without killing, forgery without false handwriting. Precisely, he replied. The most dangerous criminals are not those who employ crude violence, Watson, but those who manipulate truth itself, who understand that in our civilized society, a man's reputation may be as vital as his life, and that the death of one may serve as effectively as the death of the other. Mallory very nearly succeeded. Had he not been so meticulous in his helpfulness, so eager to provide us with every detail of printing-house practice, he might have escaped detection entirely. His own knowledge betrayed him, I observed. Indeed, he could not resist demonstrating his expertise, and in doing so he provided me with the very clues I needed to unravel his deception. It is a common failing of clever criminals, Watson. They cannot quite believe that others might be equally clever. The fog had lifted at last, and evening sunlight slanted through the streets as we rattled homeward. The mystery of Sir Lionel Harcourt's fatal signature had been solved, and justice, in its way, had been served. Chapter 10. The Weight of a Name. The arrest of Edwin Mallory was conducted with that discretion which characterises the more sensitive operations of Scotland Yard. There were no reporters present, no public spectacle to feed the appetite of the penny press. Inspector Gregson understood, as did we all, that the true victim of this affair had been Sir Lionel Harcourt, and that his memory deserved protection from the sensationalism that might otherwise have attended such revelations. The confession itself was withdrawn from all official records and, in the presence of Lady Harcourt, Holmes and myself, was consigned to the flames in the fireplace of the study where it had supposedly been written. We watched in silence as the paper curled and blackened, as Sir Lionel's transferred signature dissolved into ash. It seemed a fitting end to a document that had never truly belonged to him, a false testament that had briefly threatened to eclipse a lifetime of genuine achievement. Lady Harcourt had borne the ordeal with remarkable fortitude, though I detected in her manner a weariness that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. She thanked Holmes with quiet dignity, pressing into his hand an envelope that I later learned contained a cheque of considerable size, which Holmes characteristically donated to a charity for impoverished legal clerks. As we took our leave, she stood, framed in the doorway of her home, a figure of resilient grace against the weight of recent trials. "She will recover," Holmes remarked as our cab carried us away from Belgrave Square. "She is stronger than appearances suggest, Watson. The worst has passed, and truth, however painful its revelation, is ultimately more bearable than the burden of doubt." In the days that followed, the machinery of justice ground forward with its customary deliberation. Mallory, confronted with the evidence Holmes had assembled, elected to make a full confession rather than face trial. The details of the contractual fraud emerged in their entirety, confirming Holmes's reconstruction of motive. Weatherby and Sons had indeed secured a favourable settlement 15 years prior through deliberate misrepresentation of material facts, a deception that had saved the firm from bankruptcy, but which would have exposed it to ruinous liability had Sir Lionel's investigation proceeded. The firm itself was placed into receivership, its assets distributed among creditors and defrauded parties. 3 generations of publishing history came to an ignominious end, a legacy destroyed not by changing markets or foreign competition, but by one man's unwillingness to face the consequences of his predecessor's desperate choices. That Mallory himself had not been party to the original fraud made his subsequent crime no less damning. He had inherited a lie and chosen to compound it rather than expose it. Miss Finch, I was pleased to learn, secured a position with another publisher of legal texts, taking with her Sir Lionel's unfinished manuscripts and the hope that they might eventually see publication under circumstances more honourable than those Mallory had intended. Dr. Rowan continued his practice, though I fancied he bore a certain chastened quality after the affair, as though he'd been reminded of the limitations of his professional focus and the dangers of seeing only bodies while remaining, blind to the larger context in which they existed. It was perhaps a fortnight after these events that Holmes and I found ourselves once more in our sitting room at Baker Street, the November fog having returned with renewed persistence to press against our windows. Holmes had been unusually quiet throughout the evening, occupying himself with a monograph on the differentiation of tobacco ash that he had been composing intermittently for some months. Yet I could sense that his thoughts were elsewhere, that some aspect of the Harcourt case continued to occupy his formidable intellect. "You are troubled, Holmes," I ventured, setting aside the medical journal I'd been reading without genuine attention. He looked up from his papers, a faint smile touching his lips. "Not troubled, Watson, merely reflective. The case has raised certain questions about the nature of truth and the mechanisms by which it may be subverted in our modern age." I waited, knowing that he would elaborate when ready. "Consider," he continued, rising to stand before the fire, "the peculiar character of Mallory's crime. He committed no violence, he administered no poison, he did not even, in the strict sense, forge Sir Lionel's signature, for the signature was genuine. Yet he very nearly succeeded in destroying a man's reputation as thoroughly as if he had struck him down in the street. Because he understood the power of documentary evidence, I suggested. Precisely. In our civilized society, Watson, we have constructed elaborate systems for establishing truth. We train experts to authenticate handwriting. We develop scientific methods for analysing physical evidence. We build institutions dedicated to the impartial evaluation of facts. All of this is necessary and proper. Yet Mallory demonstrated that these very systems, these safeguards we have erected against deception, can themselves become instruments of fraud when wielded by someone who understands their operation intimately. He turned from the fire to face me fully. Every expert who examined that confession confirmed its authenticity. They were not wrong, Watson. Within the parameters of their examination, within the questions they were trained to answer, they spoke accurately. The handwriting was Sir Lionel's. The signature was genuine. The paper and ink were consistent with materials he might have used. They confirmed what they saw because they saw truly. What they did not see, because it required a different kind of vision entirely, was that truth and authenticity are not identical. That genuine components may be assembled into a false whole. You showed them what they had missed, I said. I showed them what their training had not prepared them to look for, Holmes corrected gently. The fault was not theirs. They answered the questions posed to them with honesty and skill. The deception lay in ensuring that the wrong questions were asked, that attention was directed toward authentication rather than context, toward the signature itself rather than the circumstances of its placement. He returned to his chair and took up his pipe, though he did not immediately light it. There is a broader lesson here, Watson, one that extends beyond this particular case. We live in an age of increasing specialization, where expertise becomes ever more refined and narrow. The chemist understands chemistry, the handwriting expert understands penmanship, the physician understands the body. Yet crimes like Mallory's occur precisely in the spaces between these specializations, in the synthesis of knowledge from disparate fields toward criminal purpose. Which is why your method remains essential, I observed. You refuse to be bound by any single discipline. You bring chemistry and observation and psychology to bear simultaneously. I try, Watson, he said with characteristic modesty, though I confess that in this case, the solution came not from any particular brilliance of deduction, but from a willingness to question what everyone else had accepted. The unused blotter troubled me from the beginning because it represented an absence, a thing that should have been present but was not. Most observers focus on what is there. The real art lies in noting what is missing. We sat in companionable silence for some minutes, the fire crackling softly and the fog pressing ever closer beyond our windows. I found myself thinking of Sir Lionel, of a life devoted to justice and scholarship brought to its natural end, then very nearly defamed by a scheme of remarkable sophistication. How close Mallory had come to success. How easily the truth might have remained buried beneath layers of expert authentication and plausible motive. Holmes, I said at length, do you suppose there are other cases like this? Other reputations destroyed by similar methods that were never detected? His expression grew sombre. Almost certainly, Watson. Mallory's technique, while executed with unusual skill, is not inherently beyond the capacity of others with similar knowledge and resources. Every technology, every advancement in the science of authentication, creates new vulnerabilities even as it closes old ones. It is the price we pay for living in an age of expertise. A rather pessimistic view, I suggested. Perhaps, he acknowledged, yet there is a countervailing force. For every criminal who learns to exploit the systems we create, there are investigators who learn to detect such exploitation. The game evolves, Watson. Methods improve. Awareness grows. What succeeded yesterday may fail tomorrow. He lit his pipe at last and gazed toward the window, though the fog rendered the street beyond invisible. In the end, the Harcourt case reminds us that in civilized society, a man's name may prove deadlier than any weapon if one knows how to sign it. Reputation is built slowly, through years of honest conduct, yet it may be destroyed in moments by those who understand that authenticity is not truth, that what appears genuine may serve purposes profoundly false. But you prevented that destruction, I said. Sir Lionel's name has been cleared, his reputation restored. In this instance, yes, Holmes replied quietly. But how many other names have been less fortunate? How many reputations lie buried beneath false confessions, and manufactured evidence that no one thought to question. These are the cases that trouble me, Watson. Not the dramatic murders or the spectacular robberies, but the quiet assassinations of character that occur in the margins of official records, accepted as truth because they bear the superficial markers of authenticity. It was a melancholy note on which to end our discussion, yet I understood the source of Holmes's disquiet. He had solved the case before us, had brought a clever criminal to justice, and vindicated an innocent man's memory. But the victory, however complete, could not erase the knowledge that similar injustices might be occurring elsewhere, undetected and unredressed. The fog outside our window seemed to press closer still, and in its grey obscurity I saw a metaphor for all the uncertainties that attend human judgment, all the difficulties inherent in distinguishing truth from skilled imitation. Yet I saw also, in the figure of my friend silhouetted against the firelight, a reason for hope. So long as there remained men of Holmes's calibre, men unwilling to accept convenient explanations or to mistake authentication for truth, then justice retained its champion, and reputation its defender. We spoke no more of the case that evening. The fire burned low, the fog held its vigil beyond our windows, and in the comfortable silence of our sitting room, I reflected that perhaps this was enough. Not victory over all injustice, but victory in this instance. Not the elimination of deception, but its detection in this particular case. We could not save every reputation unjustly assailed, but we had saved one, and in the careful prosecution of such individual cases, in the patient accumulation of small triumphs over falsehood, perhaps the larger battle against deception might ultimately be won. The weight of a name, Holmes had said. I understood now what he meant. In the ledgers of reputation, in the careful accounting by which society judges character and distributes trust, a signature carries enormous force. It confirms, it authenticates, it bears witness to identity itself. And when that signature is deployed in service of falsehood, when it is made to testify against the very person whose identity it represents, then one of civilization's fundamental mechanisms has been corrupted at its source. Yet we had set things right. The false confession had been exposed, the criminal brought to account, the innocent name cleared. It was the work Holmes did, the work to which he had dedicated his remarkable abilities. And as I watched him there, lost in contemplation before the fire, I felt anew that sense of privilege that came from witnessing genius in service of justice, however imperfectly that justice might be achieved in our flawed and fog-bound world.